Hello, World Civilization 106 class. Welcome to week 5. And forgive me, I keep messing up on saying which week it is, so I'm grounded in the actual week to be addressed. We're going into week 5 under module 5, covering ancient India. And for those of you who have been doing all the work up until now, you are really going to notice the shift, the difference, at least conceptually, in terms of concepts going from ancient Israel into ancient India. And I hope that you enjoy it, but yes, it is definitely a very different realm of thought in terms of the way that the religions develop, and shifting from what you've been studying is even when you look at ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, I think it's fair to say that there's just something it feels very, you're in a different part of the world when we shift over into this section. And next week we're going to cover Buddhism even more so, and different branches of Far Eastern culture. I really love these two sections, but I also feel very frustrated in that there's a lot left out. First of all, we're talking about huge civilizations that deserve a class in their own right. I could do a whole entire class all semester on India, on China, and then later we're going to be talking about Japan and Korea, but smaller Southeast Asian nations also are very fascinating, that I'm not going to be able to cover as well. I myself, several years ago, just before the pandemic, I spent about 3 months in Europe, mainly in Leiden, Netherlands, and then I spent 9 months in Asia. Thailand was my base. I had an apartment in Cambodia for a few months, and I went to go see my daughter's family in the Philippines. I stayed with a friend in Hong Kong, a total of 3 months, and I went to Macau. So I was able to, spend some good amount of time in those places, and definitely get a better feel for how some of the history that we're going to be covering actually looks in practice, and the role that it plays in conceptualizing the civilizations, these various civilizations that embrace some of these ideas that we cover. But unfortunately, for instance, I really don't cover Cambodia very well, and that's very frustrating, even though now I invested a lot of time in Cambodia. Same with Thailand. And I have a lot to say about that. But one of the things I just want to point out, because we're going to learn more about those in the next week, that part of the world, is that we start with India, and we see that in much of Asia, China and India are the big cultural powerhouses that often influence the smaller nations around them. And so, and there's an interchangeableness even between those two superpowers. Now, if you look historically, India and China, for example, even right now, are at odds with each other on a geopolitical level. And you will learn that Vietnam has had a long-lasting kind of tension with China, and at the same time, Vietnamese culture and history has been heavily influenced by China. And I can go on and on of all these different variables. When I was in Thailand, what I was surprised to learn is how much Hindu influence still was incorporated into their Buddhism. And so, if you find any of these subjects really interesting, and you see that I didn't get a chance to touch on more of what you would have liked to have to be learning or to talk about, please feel free to contact me. So we're starting this week with ancient India. We're learning about Hinduism. We're going to then talk about Jainism and Buddhism coming out of the Indian world and mainly the Hindu religious systems. And at the end, I have a video on Buddhism and hell. And this is very fascinating. Now, that video actually would be much better placed to put in next week's module, except that I already have a lot of videos. I've kind of maxed out my space for what to cover in next week. And so what I want you to realize is that when you watch the last video on hell and Buddhism, which is a really interesting video, the discussion of Confucianism, for example, and its fusion into some of these Buddhist stories is going to make more sense, and it's going to be easier to follow after you look at the next week module. And when we talk about various places that missionaries of Buddhism were able to go to. Now, I also just want you to take note that these Religion for Breakfast series, which are one of my favorites, you'll notice that he really plays on various scholarly approaches, things that are debated, and gives you a chance to look at things, always looking at things from a slightly different angle. So this week we're going to have a discussion of the really two legacies of Ashoka. Actually, it's mainly one legacy, but I give you a link to somebody challenging the standard narrative of Ashoka, who's a very important figure in Indian history and very important to Buddhist history. But there's a challenge to the standard narrative nonetheless. And what I'm always hoping that what you're doing is you're going through, we saw how ancient Israel there was debates about archaeology versus the actual stories in the Bible. You are seeing that everywhere historians go, this challenge to narratives is occurring. And I think in a way that makes it not so much chaotic and so relativistic that you can't believe in anything, but it should help us pause and really decide that if we're interested in a particular part of the world, that could be U.S. history, any kind of history, we really want to spend the time to look at what we're dealing with. Because especially with the internet, it's so easy to just jump on, get Google to take us to a certain place. And I fall into this trap at times where I hear something, I say, and I look it up and I check my phone and I think I have this solid thing down. And actually, this one source is just is floating around all over the internet, and it looks like there's a whole bunch of sources, and it's the same one source, and it looks like you have more information that you're working with than you actually do. And so sometimes those of us who are in this profession, we have to rein ourselves in at times and be like, okay, are we doing what we always try to warn our students not to do? Look at information with a broad lens. What I will say this also before I go, and I'll talk more about this next week, is I want to always remind you that when we are learning about ancient civilizations and we cover religious texts, those are always the ideals. Okay? So if you're Catholic, think about how many of you are Catholic, but if I asked you, tell me what your texts, explain for me what a Catholic thinks or feels or believes. You might say, I don't know, I go to church, ask my priest. Well, if the priest explains all these ideas and you don't know about them or never heard of them, it's almost like you're in two different belief systems, but yet you are from the same one, right? That priest is educated in all these topics, but if you don't know anything about them and yet you are very much a part of that world, then we're talking about different levels of existence even within the realm of your religious heritage, right? And that can go for anyone. I have a lot of friends that are Jewish. They might be culturally Jewish. They go to the synagogue a little bit. They might even know the prayers in Hebrew, but they don't know how to translate the prayers from Hebrew to English. I've had Muslim friends that were the same. They can recite the Quran in Arabic, but then you say, well, what does it mean? Or they say, well, I don't know Arabic. I just learned these prayers. And so they have to get a scholar to help explain. And so again, what I'm trying to say is that you're learning, in this history, just be careful to not fall into the trap to say, now that we studied this particular subject, we know how people thought by understanding, by reading these things. In ancient Egypt, for instance, how many Egyptians actually knew the content of the Egyptian Book of the Dead outside of the priests? It's a good question. And we don't really know the answer to that. But I think you get what I'm saying. So anyhow, that's all I'm going to say for now. I hope that you keep going into these modules, enjoying what you're learning. I hope that you will contact me if you have any questions regarding the content. And I want to remind you, I understand that life is full of many obstacles. Please, please don't hesitate to contact me if you're struggling keeping up with the work and you have personal problems. You don't have to tell me all your personal problems. You just need to communicate with me that you're having some and that you would like to still stay in this class and you still would like to get the grade that you would like, and like what alternative arrangements can be made. By you communicating with me, we can figure out some things, okay? So that's it. I hope you're having a good week as best as possible. There's a lot of heavy stuff on the news as always. I can barely ever keep up. I always keep wanting to communicate with all of you, check in and see how you're doing as you're seeing all this like very negative energy, very depressing, very grim stuff out there. And so I just want you to know that as your professor, I realize that there's a lot going on outside of just this class. And so if you ever feel the need to talk anything about that, if that's affecting you at all in a certain way. I had a student who was deeply, deeply emotionally distraught over Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Some of you also have relatives in that parts of the world where you could become more invested in what's happening on the news. It's not so distant. Maybe relatives in Texas or somewhere else, or Buffalo. So just, talk to me and communicate. And, I'm trying to be here for you for everything, for this whole ride for this semester, okay? So peace and blessings. We'll be in touch.